In 1966, if you wanted all-out performance from a Pontiac, well, you went with the GTO. But if you wanted GTO looks at a slightly cheaper price, well, then the LeMans was right up your alley. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, an amazing collection with more than 170 cars that tell all kinds of interesting stories about what was happening, especially in the American auto manufacturing world. And this car, this 1966 Pontiac LeMans, is going to be a fun little story to tell. But before we get there, make sure you like and subscribe. And also, if you've got a comment about something I got right, or maybe something I got wrong, or maybe just some fun story about a 1966 Pontiac, make sure you comment down below. Now, before we dive too much into the 1966 LeMans, we have to tell the story about how LeMans began and its roots in the Tempest. The LeMans started out in 1961 as a trim package for the compact Pontiac Tempest. It was lightweight, economical, and innovative. But Pontiac back then knew that buyers were starting to want more than just efficiency. They wanted style, luxury, performance. That's where the LeMans comes in. As a top-tier trim for the Tempest, it added premium interior touches like bucket seats, better upholstery, and a more upscale feel. But what really made it stand out was under the hood. By 1963, the LeMans was available with a 326 cubic inch V8. What started as a humble economy car became a performance car. Then in 1964, they made a bold move. It wasn't just a trim package anymore for the Tempest. The LeMans was its own model. And a new legend was born that year. The engineers, led by John DeLorean, dropped a 389 V8 into the LeMans and created the GTO, and the muscle car era was in full swing. By '66, the LeMans had really come into its own. It had sleek, flowing lines, a wider stance, a more aggressive look. Buyers could choose from a variety of powerful engines, including the 326. 66 model year also saw a new front grille design, improved suspension, upgraded interior, making it one of the most stylish and desirable mid-size cars of its time. And as we know, Pontiac wasn't done yet, but in '66, well, the LeMans was already making history, one wide track mile at a time. Now, before we look at the 1966 Pontiac, I want to briefly show you a 1966 Chevrolet Supersport Impala. And you'll notice some of the styling lines that are similar to what you're going to see on that LeMans in just a moment. And specifically, talking about this line right here. They call it the Coke bottle styling. And let's go over and take a look and see how that kind of incorporates itself into the LeMans as well. Now let's take a look at how Pontiac handled the same styling for 1966. Remember, it was still within the GM world, but it had different desires as to what they wanted to achieve, but they also had certain goals that GM wanted, which was that Coke bottle styling. Once again, you see how the line comes up over the rear fender right here, similar to what you saw in that Impala, that Supersport over there, although they do it just slightly differently. When you go to the back, one thing you'll notice is that if you got a Pontiac LeMans, you got different taillights than you would get in a GTO. See how they're vertical? Well, we just happen to have a Pontiac GTO right here in the museum, a 1966, so we can compare them directly. And notice that you've got a very distinctive GTO style taillight we were used to seeing in a very different style back in with this blacked out center, or the paint colored center with the Pontiac word right here. Go back over to the Pontiac LeMans, and you've got, once again, the vertical taillights just off to the side, and then this chrome section all the way across the back. At a 115-inch wheelbase, I believe it was about a 206 overall length for this car. And while it was subtly different over the rear wheels, when you went to the front, it was definitely a distinctive look for Pontiac. They had this beak, this little center section that became very synonymous with the Pontiac look. Didn't matter whether it was the Firebird or any of the Pontiacs, you had a very distinctive look. And if you got the LeMans, I believe the LeMans was distinctive in having, different than the Tempest, these little chrome sections right here to make it stand out just a little bit more, let people know that you were buying the upscale version of the Tempest, although at this point, once again, the LeMans was its own separate line, but it shared the styling with the Tempest. By the way, while the city in the France I call Le Mans, when it comes to the Pontiac, I call it a LeMans because that's what folks called it back in those days. Let's take a look under the engine compartment for this 1966 Pontiac LeMans, and here we have a 326 cubic inch engine. The 326, I think, started life in 1963. It was actually a 389 cubic inches that they reduced the bore, the size of the pistons, just slightly, so that it came in back then at 336 cubic inches, just slightly bigger than what they were saying. They were calling it a 326. As legend has it, it was because General Motors had a rule at that point. They didn't want to produce motors that were larger than 330 cubic inches. That's why we had the 327, for example. Apparently they caught on pretty quickly though, and very quickly it became from 336 cubic inches down to 326 cubic inches. So by the time this was being produced, it was a real live, honest to goodness 326. I believe the base engine was a 6-cylinder that gave you 165 horsepower. You could bump up to the Sprint 6. That got you 207 horsepower. They actually had a big advertising campaign talking about the performance of that engine. But most people who really wanted performance were going to bump up. They were going to pay just a little bit more. To get the base 326 cubic inch, 250 horsepower engine, I think you were going to pay $84. There was the HO engine that was available. That was going to give you 285 horsepower. And for that, you were going to pay an extra $157. The primary difference was that you had a 4-barrel carburetor versus a 2-barrel carburetor on the 326. The one thing you could not get on a Le Mans back then was a 389 cubic inch engine, because that was reserved for the GTO. For 1966, the inside of the Pontiac LeMans was very similar, but also slightly different than what you were going to get in 1965. The most obvious thing that you would notice in changing from 65 to 66, 1965 they actually had a chrome section right down here, and some of these elements were incorporated into that. For 1966, they really extended this round section all the way around the bottom and made it so everything was kind of enclosed into this section right here. Once again, a minor change, and kind of remember, that was what things were about back those days. You know, from one year to the next, you had to make subtle changes just so people always thought they had a new car. It was called planned obsolescence. The idea was that if you got into last year's car, you'd think, oh, that one's a little different than the new car. Maybe I need to get a new car. That was the goal for automakers for an awful long time. Make subtle changes from year to year, or in some cases, pretty radical changes to make people want to go out and buy a new car. Inside, plenty of other changes as well. There were updated upholstery patterns. They had some new patterns, new colors. There were some minor changes to the door design as well. Probably the most significant thing that you would notice, I think, is the fact that they went to a 2-spoke steering wheel versus the 3-spoke steering wheel that you would get before. But the most spectacular thing about this car, of course, is the fact that it's a convertible. I mean, red on the outside, white on the inside. Imagine that you came home one day and this is what you were driving and pulled into your driveway. I guarantee you, folks on either side, your neighbors, were going to go, wow, look what they just came back with. A Pontiac LeMans. What a cool looking car. This was all about the style. They didn't really care, for the most part, those neighbors didn't, about what you had under the hood. What they cared about was the fact that you could put the top down and you could go cruising and enjoying the sunshine, the breeze in your hair in a pretty cool looking Pontiac. As time went along, the Le Mans evolved as well. I love the 66 and 67 styling. I particularly love the 68 and 69. Over time, especially in the late 70s, it becomes a much boxier looking car and quite frankly not as attractive as this generation right here. The end of the line for the Pontiac Le Mans as a midsize car comes in 1981. But interestingly enough, the Le Mans body lived on in NASCAR for a couple more years. In fact, they were still winning races on the super speedways in 1983 with a 1981 body style from the Le Mans. Now, the Le Mans name wasn't completely over at that point. There was a partnership between Pontiac and Daewoo, a Korean car company, and they came up with the Le Mans again. Very different creature, didn't last very long. Ultimately, that partnership went away, and of course, Pontiac itself went away in 2002. So we're not likely ever to see a Le Mans ever come back again, at least as a Pontiac. But when it was running, when this car was on the road, when this convertible was driving down the street, even though it had the 326 cubic inch engine under the hood, boy, this had great style. It may not have had the ultimate performance the GTO had, but what a great looking car you could talk about as you were driving down the road and waving at your friends.